Hi, Nigel Giam here, GP Training Program Director for St Mary's and Course Director for MentorMRCGP CSA courses. I've decided to put together a series of podcasts to look at strategic approaches to the CSA, and this follows on from my initial presentation, which was undertaken about 7 years ago now. If you want to have a look at that original podcast, it's on my website, www.passmrcgp.com, along with articles as to how to approach the different behavioural domains. So the objective of these podcasts is really to start looking at the behavioural competencies, the 16 competencies that you're assessed on in the CSA and given feedback onto your e-portfolio after the exam. Before we start, I think it's really important to actually consider what the CSA is testing you on, because actually if we look at competency 6, which does not make appropriate working diagnosis or identify a range of differential possibilities, what's really interesting is that this is only one competency out of 16. So one thing is absolutely clear. The CSA is not a diagnostic-driven exam. It's a narrative-driven exam. And actually, if you start thinking about what we deal with as GPs, we're dealing with patients who are coming in every day with stories. We don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis at the end of that consultation to manage that patient. So if it's narrative-driven, we need to start thinking about how these narratives strategically are written up and given over to role players. Stories very simply have a start, a middle, and an end. And the way to see organisation and structure is moving from point A to point B. So we'll come back to this concept in a second. So organisation and structure doesn't equate to having a set list of questions which you're going to ask independent of the response. In fact, if you do that, what's going to happen is it's going to appear very formulaic and your questions will appear out of context. Now, I guess one of the major issues here is that when we're nervous, the tendency is for us to lose reactivity. And actually, organisation and structure is all to do with reactivity and fluency. The analogy really is a ping-pong match. You ask a question, the response comes back as the ping-pong, and your next response, your next question is reactive to where that ping-pong has landed. So it's really, really important that you're listening, acknowledging, and reacting. Now, when you're nervous, that's difficult. The reason being because you're just thinking of the next question you want to ask, and then suddenly you run out of questions and then you go, do you smoke? Do you drink alcohol? What's that got to actually do with what the patient's presenting with? Nothing in most instances. Every time you ask a question out of context, what you're doing is you're hitting that ping pong ball off the table and the match stops. Rapport is broken. So let's think about stories. If I give a story over to a role player who I want to play out a specific role in the CSA, that story is going to be split into two sections: information I can freely give you, and then everything else is I can only give you this if you specifically ask me in context. And it's this in context that's really, really important. So let's look at an example. Patient comes to see you with an undifferentiated headache. Now, questions that you would use in everyday general practice: tell me more about this headache, anything else you'd like to talk about, anything I missed. These are valid questions. However, recognise that the CSA is not a cot. So it's very important to understand again how that role play has been written up. Information can only be given to you if you specifically ask. You don't ask, you don't get. So strategically, let's go back into the story, to the beginning of the story. Let's call that point A that we mentioned before. If we just go back to the start, when did this headache start? It started yesterday. Now, if we're playing ping pong, your next logical question would be to open up what happened yesterday. Can I ask, what were you doing yesterday when you got this headache? Or is it the gym? And may I ask, what were you doing at the gym when the headache came on? Well, I was lifting a weight above my head, and then suddenly I felt this headache come on. So it came on very suddenly. And then what happened? I felt quite unwell, actually. And you mentioned unwell. What then happened? Well, I sat down. I think I may have actually fainted for a second. Gosh, so you blacked out? I think so. So immediately, just by following up on cues, opening up the narrative, I have a headache that came on suddenly, potentially causing or association with a blackout, and that's potentially quite serious. That's going to help me gauge my management plan when I start thinking about how to kind of manage the patient with the diagnosis as opposed to just the diagnosis. So focus on the story before you focus on the symptom. Where exactly is the pain? What's it feel like? It's Socrates, site, onset, character, radiation. Again, keep your questions single-barreled. You don't want to be asking multiple-barreled questions. You're not throwing 20 ping-pong balls over the table. Just one ping-pong ball, get the response before you ask your next question. But to help us decide whether this headache is potentially serious or not, we need to ask the appropriate red flag questions. Now, some of these questions will need to be signposted to patients, because if they don't make sense, if you're not sharing your thought processes, then again, the question may appear out of context. You're hitting the ping pong ball off the table. So story before symptom before system. Know the difference between a COT and what works in a COT and what works in a CSA. And we'll start again strategically looking about how you gather data in this way in the next podcast. I hope you found this one useful. Do check out the resources on the website, Facebook and Twitter. Many thanks for listening in. Over and out for now.